The first Vexian ship did not arrive with the roar of cannons, but with the quiet grace of a falling leaf. It was a vessel of polished obsidian and soft, internal light, shaped like a teardrop, and it hung in Earth's orbit for 3 silent days, a cosmic enigma that brought the frantic rhythm of human life to a standstill. When they finally spoke, their voices were not a booming declaration of conquest, but a symphony of harmonized frequencies that translated into every human language as an offer of friendship. They called themselves the Vexian Imperium, an ancient civilization that had watched humanity's turbulent adolescence from afar. And now that we had taken our first tentative steps into space, they had come to welcome us to the Galactic community. Their emissary, Praetor Kalin, was the physical embodiment of their message. Tall and impossibly slender, with skin that shimmered like captured starlight and eyes the color of a twilight sky, he moved with a placid confidence that made the gruff, angular movements of human leaders seem almost brutish in comparison. He spoke of shared knowledge, of ending poverty and disease, of a future where humanity could achieve its full potential under their benevolent guidance. There were skeptics, of course, but their warnings were drowned out by a global chorus of hope. For a species that had spent its entire history fighting itself, the promise of a peaceful, prosperous future was a paradise too tempting to refuse. That was 10 years ago. Now, what historians called the Golden Decade was in full bloom. The Vexian gifts had been everything they promised, and more. Their gene therapies had eradicated cancer, Alzheimer's, and 1,000 other ailments that had plagued humanity for millennia. Their zero-point energy modules provided clean, limitless power, silencing the angry debates over climate change and healing the scarred face of the planet. Under their tutelage, humanity had established permanent colonies on Luna and Mars, not as desperate outposts, but as thriving cities shielded by Vexian atmospheric processors and fed by their advanced hydroponics. Dr. Eris Thorne had been at the very heart of that initial exchange, a lead xenobotanist on the first contact science team. He had been a true believer, a man who saw in the Vexians the fulfillment of a lifelong dream of cosmic companionship. He had personally overseen the integration of Vexian flora into Earth's ecosystems, marveling at the sun petal flowers that could convert solar energy with 99% efficiency and the root weavers that could detoxify even the most poisoned soil. He had stood beside Praetor Kalin on global broadcasts, his face beaming with genuine optimism as he explained to a captivated world how this partnership would elevate not just humanity, but life itself. It was a sun petal that first planted the seed of doubt in his mind. He was in the Amazon, inspecting a terraforming project meant to reclaim areas lost to deforestation. The Vexian flora had worked perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. A vast carpet of shimmering, golden sun petals stretched to the horizon, a breathtaking sight. But as Eris knelt and pushed aside the broad, iridescent leaves, he found nothing beneath them. There was no undergrowth, no native insects, not even the familiar scent of damp earth. The soil was sterile, utterly dominated by the intricate network of Vexian roots. The native species, the vibrant, chaotic life that had defined the rainforest for millions of years, had been quietly and completely choked out. The Vexian plants were not coexisting. They were conquering, replacing the local biome with a beautiful but sterile monoculture. When he raised his concerns with the Ministry of Xeno Relations, he was met with polite dismissals. It was a small, acceptable loss. They argued, a necessary trade-off for global restoration. He was told not to disrupt the narrative of progress, but the unease lingered, a cold knot in his stomach that no amount of official reassurance could untie. He began his own research, in secret, working late in his private lab, well after his assistants had gone home. He sequenced the sun petal's genome again, this time looking not for its miraculous properties, but for flaws, for secrets. He found one, embedded deep within the non-coding regions of its DNA, almost like a dormant piece of junk code, was a synthetic retrovirus. It was inert, harmless, but it was structured with a terrifying precision. It was a key, designed to activate and rewrite the genetic code of any living cell it encountered, but only upon receiving a specific, complex protein signal. It was a weapon, hidden in plain sight, a biological time bomb planted in the heart of Earth's renewed biosphere. His discovery shifted his perception of everything. He started observing the people around him, especially those who had eagerly accepted the Vexians' most advanced medical gifts, the continuum treatments that promised to halt the aging process. They were healthy, vibrant, and unfailingly positive. They were also placid. The fiery passion he remembered in his old university colleagues had been replaced by a serene contentment. Heated debates in the lab became calm consensus-building exercises. Public protests, once a messy but vital part of society, had dwindled to almost nothing. People were happy, but it was a shallow, manufactured happiness, a placid acceptance of the new status quo. The Vexians weren't just changing the planet, they were changing humanity, sanding down the rough, chaotic edges of human nature until all that was left was a compliant, agreeable workforce. He knew he was being watched. His requests for certain restricted Vexian data had been subtly denied, and his network access was suddenly plagued by glitches. He needed an ally, someone outside the compromised circles of science and politics. He thought of Commander Eva Rostova. He had met her only a few times during formal security briefings for the Ares Prime project, the massive joint venture shipyard in Martian orbit. Rostova was the ranking human officer, a woman with a compact, powerful frame and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She was a product of the old world, a soldier who carried an aura of quiet competence and an almost palpable skepticism. She treated the Vexians with professional courtesy, but Eris had never seen the starstruck awe in her eyes that was so common among other officials. She saw them not as saviors, but as a foreign power, a potential variable in a complex strategic equation. Getting a secure message to her was a risk, but staying silent was a greater one. He buried a coded data packet within a routine botanical supply request being sent to the Mars colony, a simple string of prime numbers that was an old distress signal from his university days. He could only hope she was sharp enough to see it and curious enough to respond. 2 agonizing weeks passed before a reply came, hidden in the metadata of a planetary weather report. It was a single, encrypted coordinate and a time. The meeting point was an abandoned geological survey dome in the desolate expanse of the great Martian plain, far from the prying sensors of the Ares Prime station. Eris pulled the collar of his environment suit tighter against the thin, ochre dust that swirled around his rover. The decommissioned survey dome was a skeletal ruin, its plasteel panels cracked and scarred by decades of relentless wind. Inside, the air was cold and still. Commander Rostova stood waiting by a defunct drilling rig, her face illuminated by the stark beam of her shoulder lamp. She wore a simple officer's duty uniform, but held a compact pulse rifle with a practiced ease that was far from ceremonial. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You took a significant risk coming here. Doctor, an even bigger one contacting me. This had better be more than a theory about aggressive flowers." Eris's throat was dry. He removed a data slate from his pack and projected a holographic display between them. He showed her everything: the sterile soil in the Amazon, the hidden viral code in the sun petal's DNA, the statistical charts showing a dramatic, worldwide decline in markers for aggression, dissent, and extreme emotional responses, a decline that correlated perfectly with the rollout of the continuum treatments. "They're not our partners, Commander," Eris said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "They're farmers, and we are the crop. They are cultivating us, weeding out the traits they find undesirable, our passion, our ambition, our defiance, to turn us into a docile, manageable asset for their imperium." Rostova listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. She walked around the hologram, studying the spiraling DNA helix as if it were an enemy battle plan. The silence stretched, broken only by the faint whistle of the wind outside. He thought for a moment that she was going to dismiss him, to call him a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Instead, she deactivated his hologram with a flick of her wrist and keyed a sequence into her own wrist-mounted comm pad. "I've had my own doubts," she said, her voice flat. "The Vexians oversee all critical systems on Ares Prime. Our engineers are taught how to maintain the systems, but not how they truly work. We're glorified janitors on our own flagship project. Every strategic decision, every resource allocation is subtly guided by Praetor Kalen's advisors. We've become dependent, and they've made it feel like a privilege." She looked directly at Ari, her dark eyes intense. "You have the why. I've seen the how, but to convince anyone that we need undeniable proof, something that can't be explained away." She gestured to the data slate in her hand. "A few months ago, my team flagged an unusual energy signature coming from a sealed Vexian server hub deep within the station's core. Their official explanation was that it was a long-range cultural archive. My technician said the energy cycling looked more like a command and control matrix." Her meaning was clear. "You want to break in," Eris stated. It wasn't a question. "I can't," Rostova replied. "It's protected by Vexian biolocks. It requires a Vexian handprint and genetic signature to open. But—" She paused, a grim smile touching her lips for the first time. "The system has an emergency failsafe, a manual override that can be accessed by a senior human scientist in the event of a catastrophic system failure that incapacitates the Vexian crew. That scientist would be you, Doctor. I can simulate the system failure. I can get you to the door. But you have to open it." The plan was audacious. Suicidal, even. If they were caught, the Vexians wouldn't just execute them. They would use the incident as proof of humanity's treachery, a justification to tighten their control completely. But there was no other choice. "When?" Eris asked, his heart pounding against his ribs. 3 nights later, the Ares Prime station was rocked by a series of controlled plasma conduit explosions. Red alert klaxons blared through the corridors as Rostova's team, under the guise of emergency response, escorted Eris toward the station's restricted core. They moved through a maze of sterile white hallways, the air thick with the smell of ozone. They reached a circular vault door marked with glowing Vexian script. "The core is on the other side," Rostova said, her voice tense over their private comms channel. "You have 5 minutes before the Vexians realize this isn't a drill." Eris placed his palm on the glowing panel. A beam of light scanned his hand, then his retina. A soft chime echoed in the silence, and the heavy vault door hissed open. The room beyond was a cavern of pulsing light, servers arranged in concentric circles around a central energy core. Eris quickly located the terminal Rostova had identified and jacked in his data slate. He bypassed the public-facing files, the cultural archive filled with Vexian art and philosophy, and delved into the encrypted subdirectories. He found it almost immediately. A file so heavily protected it practically screamed its importance. It was labeled Assimilation Protocol Sol 3, Stage 1 Pacification, complete. Initiating Stage 2 Integration. His blood ran cold. He opened the file, and the Vexians' entire plan laid itself bare. It detailed the retrovirus, the neurodampening effects of the medical treatments, the planned dissolution of Earth's government, and its absorption into the Vexian Imperium as a protectorate, a compliant servant race. They hadn't come to be our friends. They had come to be our masters. As the horrifying truth filled the screen, a klaxon, deeper and more menacing than the station alarm, began to sound. The lights in the server room shifted from cool blue to a blood red. On the main view screen, the image of a Vexian archive index dissolved, replaced by the face of Praetor Kalin. The warm, charismatic smile was gone, leaving behind an expression of cold, reptilian disappointment. "Dr. Thorne, Commander Rostova." The emissary's synthesized voice filled the room, stripped of its musical cadence, now flat and hard as diamond. "I am truly disappointed. I had such high hopes for your species, but it seems the old, unruly instincts are harder to tame than we anticipated. I believe you have found something that was not meant for you." The vault door behind them began to hiss shut. They were trapped. "There will be no need for that door to open again." Praetor Kalin's voice resonated through the server room, the sound waves themselves feeling cold and sharp. "Your station is now under Imperial quarantine. We will collect you shortly. I must admit, I am eager to study your capacity for self-destructive curiosity firsthand. It is a most primitive trait." The heavy vault door sealed with a final, booming thud that echoed the closing of a tomb. Eris felt a surge of pure, primal panic, his breath catching in his throat. He was a scientist, a man of quiet labs and reasoned debate. He was not meant for this. But as he looked at Commander Rostova, he saw no fear in her eyes, only a dangerous, focused calm. She unslung the pulse rifle from her shoulder, the movement economical and precise. "He thinks he has us in a box, Doctor," she said, on her voice a low growl that cut through the Praetor's chilling monologue. "He's about to learn why you don't corner a human." She pointed to a large maintenance conduit running along the far wall, a thick bundle of insulated pipes and cabling. "My simulated system failure wasn't entirely a simulation. I planted a small plasma charge on that junction when we came in. It's not enough to breach the outer hull, but it should be enough to turn this wall into a doorway." Before Eris could process the implications, Rostova tapped a command into her wrist pad. A muffled whump shook the entire room, and the wall she had indicated buckled inward, a web of incandescent cracks spreading from the conduit junction. A blast of superheated air and vapor hissed into the chamber. "Go now," she yelled, shoving Eris toward the newly created opening. He scrambled through the jagged, glowing metal into the darkness of a service corridor, the heat searing the fabric of his suit. Rostova was right behind him, laying down a volley of suppressive fire back into the server room. The sharp crack of her pulse rifle a stark contrast to the silent energy weapons the Vexians favored. They were in the station's guts, a labyrinth of crawl spaces and maintenance tunnels that smelled of lubricant and ionized air. The main corridor alarms were a distant, rhythmic shriek, punctuated by a new sound, the soft, almost silent chime of Vexian lockdown protocols. Doors were sealing. Turrets were deploying. Kalin was turning their home into their prison. "He'll send his peacekeepers," Rostova said. Her voice strained as she led Eris at a punishing pace through the cramped darkness, her shoulder lamp cutting a frantic path ahead. "They're not soldiers. They're pacification units. Fast, silent, and they don't stop until the target is neutralized. Eris's lungs burned, his body, accustomed to a life of academic ease, screaming in protest. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every flicker of a dying emergency light felt like the glint of an enemy optic. He clutched the data slate to his chest. Its cold, hard edges the only thing that felt real in this nightmare. This was his fault. He had pulled the thread, and now the entire tapestry was unraveling. The thought was paralyzing, but Rostova's iron grip on his arm kept him moving. "Don't think, Doctor. Just run." A burst of static erupted from her comm. "Commander, this is Sergeant Jorik. We're pinned down at Junction 7. They're everywhere. We can hold them for a few minutes. Give you a clear path to Hangar Bay 12. Rostova's face tightened, a flicker of pain crossing her features before being replaced by cold resolve. "Negative, Sergeant. Rendezvous at the fallback point. That's an order." The reply was broken by the sizzle of energy weapon fire. "No can do, Commander. Someone's got to show these shiny bastards what happens when you piss off a Martian Marine. Go give 'em hell for us. Jorik out." The comm went silent. Rostova didn't speak, but a new, terrible urgency propelled them forward. They were running on the lives of her soldiers. The weight of that sacrifice settled on Eris, heavier than the data slate. He was no longer just an observer. He was a participant in a war he had unwittingly declared. They emerged from the service tunnels into a cargo transfer bay, a vast, cavernous space filled with floating containers and automated loaders that now hung silent and still. On the far side, across a zero-gravity expanse, was the blast door to Hangar 12, and between them and the door, 3 Vexian peacekeepers descended from the ceiling. They were nothing like the elegant, organic form of Kalen. They were sleek, insectoid machines of white chrome and blue light, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They had no faces, only a single, unblinking optic that glowed with cold intelligence. They raised their integrated energy casters, and the air began to hum. Rostova shoved Eris behind a large freight container. "That door is magnetically sealed and off-grid. I need you to get to that control panel next to it and bypass the primary lock. It's an old system, purely electrical. You can do it." "I'm a botanist," Eris hissed, his voice trembling. "You're a scientist," she countered, her eyes fixed on the advancing machines. "You understand system. The panel is exposed. Reroute the secondary power flow directly into the magnetic clamp actuators. It'll overload them. Now go." She broke from cover, her pulse rifle spitting coherent bolts of light that ricocheted off the peacekeeper's kinetic shielding with harmless flashes. It was a diversion, buying him seconds. Eris ran, his feet clanging on the metal deck plating. He felt impossibly exposed, his back crawling with the expectation of a searing blast. He reached the panel, his clumsy fingers fumbling to pry off the cover. The circuitry within was a chaotic tangle of wires and relays, a relic of pre-Vexian human engineering. It was crude, messy, and beautiful. He saw the logic in it, the direct flow of power. He found the secondary conduit, a thick, red-sleeved cable, and with a grunt of effort, ripped it free from its housing. A pulse blast from Rostova's rifle exploded behind him, showering him with sparks. He jammed the live cable against the actuator terminals. The panel sparked violently, and with a deep, groaning shudder, the massive blast door began to retract. "It's open!" he yelled. Rostova was falling back, her rifle clicking empty. One of the peacekeepers was down, a smoking ruin on the floor, but the other two were advancing, their pace unhurried, their victory inevitable. She sprinted for the hangar, grabbing Eris and pulling him through the opening just as the door began to slide shut again. A final energy bolt from a peacekeeper slammed into the closing door, leaving a molten scar on the thick metal. Inside the hangar, it was dark and cold. A single ship sat on the launch cradle, a relic from a bygone era. It was a Stingray-class long-range scout, a vessel designed for endurance and speed, not comfort or firepower. It was small, angular, and covered in the dust of disuse. "She's not pretty, but she's ours," Rostova said, climbing the ramp. No Vexian tech, no network connection to the station, a ghost. She powered through the pre-flight sequence with practiced efficiency while Eris strapped himself into the co-pilot's chair, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fasten the harness. The ship's engines whined to life with a low, guttural roar, a deeply human sound of controlled explosions, so different from the silent, graceful hum of Vexian drives. On the main view screen, the outer hangar doors were visible, still sealed. "They won't open them for us," Eris said, stating the obvious. "Don't need them to," Rostova replied, her hands flying across the console. "The Stingray was built for rough exits." A targeting reticle appeared on the screen, locking onto the center of the massive doors. "Hold on." She slammed a shielded red button, and the ship lurched as two kinetic penetrator missiles ignited and shot across the hangar, striking the doors with a deafening clang. They didn't explode, they punched through, leaving two small, perfect holes. Rostova firewalled the throttle, and the small scout ship shot forward like a bullet, aiming for the holes it had just created. They cleared the doors with inches to spare, the ship's hull screaming in protest as it scraped against the mangled durasteel. They were in open space, the red curve of Mars below them, the vast silver latticework of Ares Prime Station above. Immediately, alarm shrieked in the cockpit, proximity alerts, weapons lock, a swarm of Vexian patrol craft, small teardrop-shaped fighters, detached from the station and converged on their position. Blue energy beams lanced through the darkness around them. Rostova wrestled with the controls, verstemist, the tiny ship bucking and weaving through the incoming fire. "They're faster and more maneuverable," she grunted, her knuckles white on the flight stick. "But we have one advantage." She keyed a rapid sequence into the navigation computer. "They're predictable. Their pursuit vectors are flawless, which means they can be calculated." A series of coordinates flashed on Eris's screen. "The nav computer is plotting a blind FTL jump. The calculations will be unstable. The exit point will be random. And the G-forces will be hell. But it's our only way out." "Do it!" Eris yelled over the scream of the engines. The ship shuddered violently as a Vexian blast scored a glancing blow against their aft shields. The FTL drive began its high-pitched whine, a sound of reality being torn apart. Rostova angled the ship's nose toward the empty blackness between the stars, away from the comforting light of Sol. "Jumping in 3, 2, 1. The universe outside the viewport twisted into an insane vortex of light and color, and a crushing weight slammed Eris back into his seat, stealing the air from his lungs. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The roar of the engines died, the alarms fell silent, and the violent shaking ceased. Outside the cockpit was only the silent, velvet black of deep space, sprinkled with the cold, unfamiliar light of distant, unknown stars. They were alive, they were free, and they were utterly terrifyingly alone. Aris looked down at the data slate still clutched in his hand. It glowed with the secrets of the Vexian Imperium, the proof of their quiet, genocidal conquest. It was the most important discovery in human history, a weapon that could save their species. But as he looked out at the infinite, empty void, a chilling question settled in his heart. Who were they supposed to give it to? The silence in the cockpit of the Stingray was a living thing, thick and heavy. For hours, neither Eris nor Rostova spoke, each lost in the violent aftershocks of their escape. The ship drifted, a tiny speck of human defiance in an ocean of alien stars. The jump had been rough, a brutal, uncontrolled tumble through space-time. The navigation computer was fried, its screen a mess of fractured Vexian and human code, and the FTL drive was offline, complaining of a dozen critical misalignments. They were dead in the water, light years from any known human outpost. Eris finally broke the quiet, his voice hoarse. "Where are we?" Rostova was staring at the starfield, her face a mask of weary concentration. "Nowhere I recognize," she admitted, her usual sharp tone softened by exhaustion. "The emergency jump protocol is a pure scramble. It prioritizes distance over direction. We could be anywhere in the Orion Arm." She ran a diagnostic on the ship's systems, her fingers moving with a grim, methodical rhythm. The report that scrolled onto her screen was a litany of failures. "Life support is stable, but the main reactor is leaking plasma. We have maybe a week of power at this rate. Sublight engines are functional, but we have nowhere to go. We're a message in a bottle without an ocean to float in." Eris felt a wave of despair wash over him, so potent it was almost nauseating. They had the truth. They had the evidence that could ignite a revolution, and they were going to die with it. A forgotten footnote in the story of humanity's quiet subjugation. He looked down at the data slate. The screensaver was a Vexian fractal, a beautiful and endlessly complex pattern that now seemed to mock him with its perfect serial order. "There's one chance," Rostova said, wading into his dark thoughts. She pointed to a faint, reddish star on the main viewer. "The ship's long-range optical scope is still working. That star, it's a red dwarf, old and dim. According to the pre-contact stellar charts loaded into the ship's memory, it's Kepler 186. There's a 5-planet system there, unexplored, but one of them, 186, is in the habitable zone. A long shot, but it's the only one we've got." The thought of a potentially habitable world was a flicker of warmth in the freezing emptiness of their situation. "Can we make it?" Aris asked. "On sublight, it would take years," Rostova said, shaking her head. "But I might be able to get one more jump out of the FTL drive. If I bypass the safety interlocks and manually realign the primary focusing coil, I can force it to cycle. It'll tear the drive apart, but it might get us close enough to reach the planet on auxiliary power." It was another desperate gamble, a one-way ticket to a place that might not even have a breathable atmosphere. But the alternative was to slowly suffocate in the void. "Do it," Eris said, his voice finding a sliver of resolve. For the next 3 days, they worked. Rostova, with a focus that was both terrifying and inspiring, donned an EVA suit and performed a series of dangerous spacewalks, physically manhandling the damaged components of the FTL drive. Eris, meanwhile, stayed in the cockpit, his role reduced to monitoring her life signs and trying to coax the damaged nav computer into giving them a usable flight path. He pored over the data slate, not just the Vexian assimilation plan, but their entire cultural archive. He studied their history, their philosophy, their biology. He learned that they were an ancient, hive-minded species, their individuality subsumed into a collective consciousness they called the Nexus. Praetor Kalin was not a person in the human sense, but a specialized node of that consciousness, a diplomatic interface. Their goal was not malice, but order. They saw the chaos of individualistic species like humanity as a galactic disease, and their pacification was, in their view, a form of healing. They were not conquering humanity. They were curing it. The understanding didn't bring comfort, only a deeper, more profound horror. Finally, Rostova sealed the outer airlock, her suit covered in a fine layer of frozen coolant. "It's done," she said, her voice ragged with fatigue as she removed her helmet. "The drive is jury-rigged for a single final jump. If my calculations are right, it will get us to the outer edge of the Kepler 186 system. If I'm wrong—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They strapped themselves in once more. The ship groaned in protest as Rostova rerouted power, the lights flickering, the hull vibrating as if it were about to tear itself apart. The FTL drive spooled up, not with a whine this time, but a tortured, metallic shriek. The jump was even more violent than the first. The world outside dissolved into a smear of impossible physics, and Eris blacked out. He woke to the soft, insistent chime of a proximity alert. His head was pounding, and the metallic taste of blood was in his mouth. Rostova was slumped over the controls, but she was breathing. Outside the viewport, a world hung in the blackness. It was a jewel of swirling white clouds, deep blue oceans, and continents of a startling, rusty red. Kepler 186 if. They had made it. The ship was a wreck. The FTL drive was a molten slag heap, and the main reactor was in its final death throes. But the sublight engines and life support were still, miraculously, functional. They began their slow, limping descent into the planet's atmosphere. The entry was rough, the damaged ship buffeted by high-altitude winds. But Rostova, her hands steady on the controls, guided them down. They broke through the cloud cover and saw a landscape of breathtaking, alien beauty. Vast forests of crimson, tree-like flora stretched to the horizon, their leaves the color of dried blood. Jagged mountains of black, volcanic rock clawed at the sky. They found a relatively flat clearing near a river that snaked through the red forest like a vein of silver and set the Stingray down with a final, shuddering crash. The moment the engines died, an overwhelming silence fell, broken only by the frantic ticking of cooling metal. The air outside, according to the ship's sensors, was thin but breathable, high in nitrogen and oxygen. The temperature was a brisk, but survivable, 10 degrees Celsius. They had survived. They had found a refuge. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Eris allowed himself a moment of hope. But as they cautiously opened the ship's ramp and took their first steps onto the red soil of this new world, they realized they were not alone. From the edge of the crimson forest, figures emerged. They were tall and lanky, with a wiry, muscular build. Their skin was a mottled gray-green, like lichen on stone, and their large, black eyes regarded the newcomers with a startling intelligence. They were humanoid, but distinctly alien, with long, three-fingered hands and a crest of bony plates that ran from their foreheads down their spines. They carried spears tipped with sharpened obsidian and wore simple harnesses of woven, fibrous material. They were primitives, a stark contrast to the godlike Vexians, but they were not afraid and they fanned out, surrounding the crashed ship, their movements coordinated, their expressions a mixture of caution and intense curiosity. One of them, taller than the rest, with a more pronounced crest, stepped forward. It held its spear not as a threat, but as a staff of office. It opened its mouth, and a series of complex clicks and whistles filled the air. "They're called the Cathar," a new voice said, this one in perfect, unaccented English. Aris and Rostova spun around. Stepping out from behind the Cathar chieftain was a human. He was an old man, with a wild mane of white hair and a deeply lined face that spoke of a long, hard life. He was dressed in a strange mix of a tattered human spacesuit and Cathar leather. He leaned heavily on a gnarled, wooden staff, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "Don't worry," the old man said with a wry smile. "They're more afraid of you than you are of them. My name is Dr. Elias Vance. I was the chief astrobiologist of the Odyssey." Eris stared, his mind struggling to connect the name to the face. The Odyssey, the first human interstellar colony ship. It had launched almost a century ago. A bold, pre-Vexian attempt to reach the stars. It had vanished without a trace somewhere in the Perseus arm. It was a legend, a ghost story told to rookie pilots. But the Odyssey was lost. Eris stammered. "Not lost," Vance corrected gently. "Just arrived. We were hit by a gravitic shear. Threw us off course and crippled the ship. We crashed here 78 years ago. I'm the last of the original crew." He looked from Eris's clean, sterile jumpsuit to Rostova's military uniform. "Judging by your ship and your clothes, I'd say a lot has changed back home." In the heart of the Cathar village, a settlement of woven, hive-like structures built into the giant red trees. Eris and Rostova told their story. Vance listened, his expression growing darker with every word. The Cathar, though they couldn't understand the language, seemed to sense the gravity of the tale, their large eyes fixed on the newcomers. When they finished, Vance was silent for a long time, staring into the embers of a communal fire. "Benevolent saviors," he finally muttered, his voice thick with contempt. "I knew it was too good to be true. Humanity never gets something for nothing." He looked at the data slate Eris had placed on the table between them. "So you have proof. You have their entire playbook." "But we're trapped here," Rostova said, the frustration evident in her voice. "Our ship is useless. We can't warn Earth." "Perhaps," Vance said, a strange light glinting in his old eyes. He stood and gestured for them to follow him to the edge of the village, to a massive, ancient-looking tree. Woven into its trunk were strange, metallic components and thick, insulated cables that snaked up into the high branches. The Odyssey's main communications array was destroyed in the crash, he explained, but its deep space transmitter was salvageable. The Cathar helped me rig it to the ship's surviving power core. The problem is, it doesn't have the range to reach Sol. Not on its own. He pointed up, through the crimson canopy of it, to a point of light in the sky, a faint, pulsing star. That's a pulsar, a neutron star that spins hundreds of times a second, emitting a beam of electromagnetic radiation. If we can time a transmission to hit that beam at exactly the right moment, the pulsar will act as a natural gravitational lens, amplifying our signal 1,000-fold. It could reach Earth. Hope, fierce and unexpected, surged in Eris's chest. "You can do that." "I can," Vance said. "But there's a catch. Firing up the transmitter will drain the last of the Odyssey's power core. We'll only get one shot, one broadcast, and it will be the brightest thing in this sector of space. A flare that will scream, 'We are here,' to anyone who might be listening." He turned and looked at them, his gaze heavy. That includes the Vexians. If they have long-range sensors in this quadrant, they'll know exactly where the signal came from. You won't just be warning Earth. You'll be painting a target on this world. The choice was stark, a terrible weight of responsibility. To save humanity, they would have to condemn the Cathar, this innocent, primitive species that had shown them nothing but kindness, to the wrath of the Imperium. To protect their saviors, they would have to abandon their own species to a silent, creeping extinction of the soul. The weight of Vance's words hung in the thin, Lean air, heavier than the gravity of the planet. To save their own species, they would have to potentially sign the death warrant of another. Eris looked at the Cathar chieftain, who stood nearby, watching them with an unnerving, silent intelligence. These beings had a culture, a history, a life that was as valid as humanity's. Could they sacrifice them? Could they not? The ethical paradox was a razor's edge, and every possible choice felt like a betrayal. It was Rostova who broke the stalemate, her voice as unyielding as the volcanic rock that dominated the landscape. "We don't have a choice," she said, her gaze fixed on Vance. "Humanity is being lobotomized. Our culture, our spirit, everything that makes us human is being systematically erased. If we do nothing, we cease to exist in any meaningful way. That's not a choice. That's an extinction event. We send the message." Her certainty was a cold comfort, a surgeon's logic applied to a philosopher's dilemma. Eris, a man who had dedicated his life to the preservation of life in all its forms, felt a profound sense of violation. Yet, he knew she was right. What was the value of preserving one species if it meant allowing the slow, spiritual genocide of his own? "She's right," Eris said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But the Cathar deserve to know the risk. They need to understand what we're asking of them." Vance nodded slowly, his ancient eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "They're not children, Doctor. They know more about the stars than you think. Their entire oral history is a celestial map. They know what it means when a new light appears in the sky." Communicating the complex threat of the Vexian Imperium to a pre-industrial species was a monumental task. Vance acted as a bridge, translating Eris's scientific explanations and Rostova's strategic warnings into a pidgin of the Cathar's clicking language and universal symbols drawn in the red dirt. They spoke of the Silent Ones, the Mind Takers, who came not with weapons but with gifts that stole the soul. Eris used the data slate to project simple holograms showing the Vexian ships, the sterile sun petal fields, and, finally, a simplified model of the pulsar, the transmitter, and the beam of information that would lance across the galaxy. The Cathar listened with an unblinking, solemn attention. The chieftain, whose name Vance translated as Skywatcher, pointed a long, three-fingered hand at the hologram of the Vexian teardrop ship, then touched his own chest. He let out a low, mournful whistle, a sound that seemed to resonate with a deep, ancestral memory. Vance's face went pale. He says they have seen them before. Not them, but their mark." The chieftain led them to the most sacred place in the Cathar village, a deep cavern at the base of the largest tree. The walls were covered in paintings, rendered in pigments of crushed minerals and plant extracts. They depicted the history of the Cathar, their hunts, their rituals, their gods. But one painting, far older and more faded than the rest, showed a different story. It depicted teardrop-shaped objects descending from the sky, not to the red world of Kepler 186F, but to its sister planet, a world shown in vibrant green and blue. The next panel showed the green world turning a sterile, uniform gold, and the Cathar on its surface, once depicted with vibrant life, were shown as hollow, listless figures with blank eyes. Their legends speak of the first world, Vance translated, his voice a hushed whisper, a paradise that was silenced by gods who promised peace. The survivors fled here ages ago. They weren't just curious about us. They were afraid. They recognized the shape of their own apocalypse. The revelation was a hammer blow. The Vexians had been doing this for millennia, a slow, methodical plague spreading from star to star. The Cathar were not just potential victims, they were survivors of a past purge. Their decision was made before Eris even finished his plea. Skywatcher placed his hand on the data slate, then pointed to the pulsar in the sky. He let out a sharp, decisive click. The meaning was universal. Fight. The weight of the decision shifted. It was no longer a sacrifice they were forcing upon the Cathar, but a partnership. They were two vastly different species, separated by eons of technological development, now united by a common, ancient enemy. The work began immediately. The Cathar, with their intimate knowledge of the planet's geology and flora, guided Vance and Eris in securing the Odyssey's power core and running new conduits made from a highly conductive local vine. Rostova, meanwhile, became an unlikely military advisor. She found the Cathar to be surprisingly adept strategists. Their hunting techniques, which involve coordinated strikes, diversions, and the use of the terrain for camouflage, were the basis of classic guerrilla warfare. Using the Stingray's fabricators, she began to craft rudimentary weapons for them, not pulse rifles, but tools that would complement their skills-shaped explosive charges made from local chemical deposits, simple magnetic grappling launchers, and, most importantly, signal jammers designed to disrupt Vexian communications based on the frequencies Eris had pulled from their data slate. She trained them not to fight a pitched battle they could never win, but to harass, to sabotage, and to become ghosts in their own world. The day of the transmission arrived. The air was tense. The entire village gathered at the base of the communication tree, their faces turned upward. Vance sat at the master console, a Frankenstein's monster of human and alien technology, his old hands moving with a surgeon's precision. Eris and Rostova stood beside him, their own roles in this phase of the plan complete. "The pulsar is in alignment," Vance announced, his voice tight. "The window is open for the next 37 seconds. Once I start, I can't stop. The entire power core will be discharged." He looked at them one last time. "Ready." They both nodded. Vance threw a heavy and full industrial switch. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, the ground vibrating as a century of stored energy surged through the ancient tree. A beam of pure, white light shot from the apex of the canopy, a silent spear aimed at the heart of the distant pulsar. The data slate, hardwired into the system, began to glow, its memory banks disgorging their terrible truth into the beam the Vexian assimilation plan. The genetic data of the retrovirus, Rostova's own after-action report from Ares Prime, and a final, desperate plea from Eris to the people of Earth. "They are not gods," the message concluded. "They are cages. Do not go quietly." For 37 seconds, the beam held steady, a fragile thread of hope connecting two lost worlds. Then, as the last of the power died, the beam vanished, and the deep hum faded into an echoing silence. It was done. A profound quiet settled over the clearing, a mixture of hope and dread. They had thrown their stone into the cosmic ocean. Now, all they could do was wait for the ripples. They did not have to wait long. 3 weeks later, a new star appeared in the sky. It was a single, piercing point of silver light that grew steadily brighter, resolving itself not into a Vexian teardrop, but into something vast, angular, and brutally utilitarian. A ship dropped out of FTL at the system's edge and began a slow, deliberate burn toward the planet. The Stingray's surviving sensors, powered by a small Cathar-devised geothermal generator, identified it. "It's a Vexian reclamation vessel," Rostova said, her voice grim as she studied the sensor readings in the ship's dark cockpit. "A single ship, but it's a monster, a planet killer, designed for orbital bombardment and atmospheric cleansing. They're not here to pacify. They're here to sterilize." The ship was an ultimatum. It wasn't Kalen's way, not the subtle Rishin approach of a farmer. This was the response of a wounded god, a tantrum on a planetary scale. Their message had been received, not just by Earth, but by the Imperium. "They must think we're a full-fledged human resistance colony," Eris murmured, horrified. "They're using a sledgehammer to kill a gnat. It doesn't matter what they think," Rostova countered, her eyes narrowing. "It only matters what we do now." The plan had always been for the Cathar to scatter, to hide in the deep caverns and dense forests, to wage a war of attrition. But now, faced with a ship that could boil the oceans from orbit, that strategy was useless. "We can't fight that thing," Vance said, his voice heavy with defeat as he joined them in the cockpit. "It can erase this entire planet from existence before a single Cathar spear is thrown." For a moment, despair seemed to claim them all. They had won the battle of information only to lose the war for survival. But as Eris looked at the tactical display, at the single, monolithic Vexian ship, an idea, born of desperation and a deep understanding of Vexian philosophy, began to form in his mind. He remembered what he had read in their cultural archive, their rigid adherence to protocol, their reliance on the collective nexus, the suppression of individual initiative. "They sent one ship," Eris said slowly, thinking aloud. "Why just one? They could have sent a fleet. They sent one because, according to their protocols, a single reclamation vessel is the designated response for a non-compliant pre-integration world. They're following a script." He turned to Rostova. "What if we change the script? They expect a primitive world, cowering on the surface. They don't expect a counterattack. Not in space." Rostova stared at him. "With what? This ship is a coffin. We have no FTL, no weapons, and barely enough power to keep the lights on." "We have one weapon," Eris said, a wild, almost manic energy in his eyes. He pointed to the data slate. "Their own biology, the sun petal retrovirus. I have the full genetic sequence. It's a key, designed to rewrite DNA. What if we rewrite the key? What if, instead of pacifying a species, we program it to attack Vexian technology?" He looked at the hulking Vexian ship on the screen. Those ships. They're not just machines, they're semi-organic, integrated with a biological computer core that's tied directly to the Nexus. What if we can deliver a modified virus directly to that core? We can't blow it up, but maybe we can give it cancer. The plan was insane, a shot in the absolute dark, relying on a dozen untested theories of xenobiology and Vexian technology. It would mean taking the barely functional Stingray and flying it directly into the heart of the Vexian war machine. It was suicide. It was also the only chance they had. The cockpit of the Stingray became a makeshift genetics lab, a chaotic fusion of advanced science and primitive survival, with the ship's meager power routed to the medical bay's bioprinter. Eris worked with a feverish intensity that bordered on obsession. He wasn't just a botanist anymore. He was a bioweapon engineer, twisting the Vexians' tool of subjugation into a dagger aimed at their own heart. He broke down the retrovirus to its base pairs, identifying the protein signal that triggered its activation. His plan was to create a new trigger, one that would cause the virus to identify Vexian biotech, the living nervous systems integrated into their ships, as its primary target. Instead of calming a species, it would induce a state of cascading, autoimmune failure in the ship's core, a technological cancer that would spread through the vessel's systems like wildfire. "It's a contagion," he explained to Rostova and Vance, his face illuminated by the eerie blue glow of the sequencer. "Once it's in their system, it will replicate using the ship's own organic components as fuel. It won't just disable the ship, it will turn it into a carrier." While Eris played God with alien DNA, Rostova and Vance prepared the Arrow. The Stingray had no missiles, but it had a single, functional cargo launch tube designed for deploying survey probes. Vance, using his decades of experience in making do with scraps, helped Rostova modify one of the last remaining probes. They hollowed it out, turning it into a delivery vehicle for Eris's viral payload, and fitted it with a magnetic clamp system scavenged from the cargo bay. "This won't punch through their shields," Rostova stated, her hands deftly soldering a new guidance chip into the probe. "But it doesn't need to. The reclamation vessel has ventral intake ports for atmospheric sampling. They'll be open when it enters the upper atmosphere. We have to launch this probe directly into one of those ports. It's like trying to thread a needle during an earthquake while riding a unicycle." The Vexian ship descended, a mountain of white chrome and silent menace that eclipsed the sun. It settled into a high orbit, a patient god ready to pass judgment. The Cathar, under Skywatcher's command, had vanished. They were not cowering, but repositioning, following Rostova's final, desperate contingency plan. If the Stingray failed, they would retreat to the deep, geothermally heated caverns at the planet's poles, a place where they could perhaps survive the orbital bombardment to come. As the reclamation vessel began its atmospheric entry, its hull glowing a faint cherry red, the Stingray rose from the crimson forest to meet it. Their ascent was clumsy and slow, a wounded bird challenging a dragon. On the Vexian bridge, a serene, silver-skinned Vexian node, designated as Purifier 7, observed the primitive human vessel rising on its sensors. The act was so illogical, so contrary to any predictable model of self-preservation, that the Purifier's consciousness briefly queried the Nexus for guidance. The response was clinical. The target was an anomaly, displaying irrational aggression. It was to be disregarded and erased along with the planetary surface. The reclamation vessel ignored the Stingray, its primary focus on achieving its optimal bombardment altitude. "They're not even taking us seriously," Rostova growled, her hands tight on the flight controls. "Good." She pushed the sublight engines to their breaking point, the ship screaming in protest as it clawed its way into the upper atmosphere. Vance was in the co-pilot seat, his old eyes scanning the energy readouts. "Shields are still up. The ports will be protected." "Just wait," Rostova said through gritted teeth. "They'll have to cycle the shields to vent plasma during atmospheric entry. It's a design flaw in their older ships. They think no one is crazy enough to get this close." As if on cue, a section of the Vexian ship's energy field flickered for a microsecond as a massive ventral port irised open. "Now!" Rostova yelled. Vance slammed his hand down on the launch control. The modified probe shot from the Stingray's belly, a tiny fleck of metal against the colossal hull of the enemy ship. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed like it would miss, but its magnetic clamps fired, and it latched onto the inner lip of the intake port. A metallic tick clinging to the jaw of a leviathan. "Payload delivered," Vance breathed, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his face. Purifier 7 registered the minor impact on the ventral hull. It was classified as a micrometeorite strike, a negligible event. Then, a new variable entered its calculations. A non-native biological agent had been detected in the atmospheric processing system. Before the purifier could fully analyze the threat, the ship began to shudder. It was a subtle vibration at first, a discordant hum that ran through the deck plates. Then, alarms began to chime, not with the strident urgency of human alarms, but with a series of confused, melodic tones. Systems were failing. The ship's internal lights flickered, shifting from their placid blue to a sickly, pulsing yellow. On the bridge, the purifier watched as its connection to the Nexus began to fray, the collective consciousness that had defined its existence dissolving into a storm of static and pain. The viral agent wasn't just attacking the ship, it was attacking its soul. The reclamation vessel, now crippled and disoriented, began to drift, its descent becoming an uncontrolled fall. Rostova fought to pull the Stingray away as the massive ship tumbled through the atmosphere, pieces of its hull breaking away in fiery streaks. "It's not enough," Eris said, his voice hollow as he watched the tactical display. "It's dying, but it's still going to hit the surface. The impact alone will cause an extinction-level event." He was right. They had poisoned the beast, but its corpse was now a continent-sized meteor aimed directly at the heart of the Cathar's lands. "The reactor core," Rostova said, her eyes alight with a final, terrible idea. "If we can detonate its reactor before it hits the lower atmosphere, the explosion will be directed upwards, away from the planet." "How?" Vance asked. "The ship is tearing itself apart. We can't get close enough to fire anything." "We don't fire," Rostova said, her voice dropping to an almost inaudible whisper. "We fly." She looked at Eris, then at Vance, her expression one of profound, final duty. "This ship has just enough fuel for one last burn. Its reactor is primitive, but if I overload it, it will go critical. It will be enough to trigger a sympathetic detonation in the Vexian core." Eris stared at her, the implication of her words settling on him like a shroud. "Eva, no. There's no other way." "Eris," she said, her voice softening for the first time. "You gave them the cure. Now let me finish the surgery." She turned to Vance. "Get him to the escape pod. It's shielded enough to survive the atmospheric blast." "Like hell," Vance shot back, his old eyes blazing. "I've been on this rock for 78 years. I've lived my life. This is a good way to end it. You go with the doctor." Before they could argue, a new voice filled the cockpit, a series of urgent clicks from Rostova's compad. It was Skywatcher. On the main screen, a grainy image appeared, relayed from a Cathar scout. It showed the Vexian ship's main engineering section, a gaping wound torn in its side from the atmospheric stress, and swarming toward it were dozens of Cathar warriors, launched from the high branches of the forest trees using crude, sap-powered catapults, using the grappling launchers Rostova had built for them to pull themselves toward the dying ship. "They're going to try and plant the rest of the explosive charges on the reactor housing," Rostova translated, her voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "They're trying to save us." It was a suicidal, a glorious charge. They were primitives with spears and courage, trying to slay a dying god. It bought the Stingray the time it needed. Rostova, her face set like stone, guided their ship not toward the escape pods, but into the fiery wound of the Vexian vessel. They flew through corridors of dying light and screaming metal, the stingray's hull groaning under the strain. They reached the main reactor chamber, a cavernous space where the Vexian core pulsed with a dying, erratic light. Rostova set their own reactor to overload. "Elias, Eris," she said, not taking her eyes off the console. "It's been an honor." Vance placed a hand on her shoulder. Eris could only watch, a silent witness to the end of a war and the birth of a legend. The stingray exploded. The small, human-made blast was the final pinprick needed to destabilize the colossal Vexian core. A wave of pure, silent energy erupted outwards, vaporizing the Cathar warriors, the stingray, and the entire reclamation vessel in a heartbeat. High in the atmosphere, the explosion blossomed, a new, violent sun that pushed back against the sky, its force directed out into the void. On the surface, the Cathar watched as the night turned to day. The shockwave, a cleansing wind that swept through the crimson forests, but left the planet itself unharmed. Months later, a new fleet arrived in the Kepler 186 system. They were human ships, dozens of them, angular and gray, bearing the insignia of a newly independent Earth. They had received the message. The Vexian Imperium, reeling from the sudden, inexplicable plague that was now spreading through their fleets from the data relayed by the reclamation vessel before its demise, was in disarray. Revolutions were igniting across their former territories. Humanity was fighting back. The first landing party found a single, human-made artifact in the center of the Cathar village, a data slate, placed on a simple stone pedestal. On it, Eris Thorn had left his final report, telling the story of the stingray, of Elias Vance, of the Cathar, and of Commander Iva Rostova. He told them how the Cathar had pulled him from a makeshift escape pod he never remembered entering. He explained how he had stayed, not as a savior, but as a student, to learn from a people who understood sacrifice. His final message was not for Earth's new government or its military, but for the future. "We were almost lost," it read, "not to an enemy, but to our own desire for an easy peace. We looked to the stars for saviors and found zookeepers. The truth is, there is no one coming to save us. There is only us. We are not the children of the galaxy waiting for guidance. We are its immune system, and we are finally awake."